evening and a hearty welcome to all of you for the Deshmukh Memorial Lecture. Now, 14th of January is a special day for the IIC because its founder president, C.D. Deshmukh, was born on 14th January. C.D. Deshmukh, what can I say, was a special person? No, that's an understatement. He was an extraordinary person, a resplendent personality. And if you had seen the exhibition, you would have seen the various facets of C.D. Deshmukh's life in various fields. He was a distinguished civil servant, governor of Reserve Bank, a member of a planning commission, finance minister in Nehru's cabinet, chairman University Grants Commission, vice chancellor Delhi University, and the life and spirit of the Indian International Center. He was a man of great intellectual clarity, integrity, and independence. If you may remember, on a point of difference with Panditji, Jawaharlal Nehru, the mighty Panditji, he resigned. He didn't agree with him. That was the strength of his conviction. And I didn't know till I saw the exhibition. He had a great love for gardening. And also fond of Sanskrit, and published a book of Sanskrit poems in 1969. And one interesting thing I learned when I was going through the exhibition will still be on, please go through it. It's an experience, it's a well worth experience. One thing which I learned was, when he learned that he stood first in the ICS, which is no mean feat, he celebrated the event with his friend by having hot malted chocolate. I suppose very few people would do it. I wouldn't celebrate with hot chocolate, surely. But I'm not Deshmukh. That was a great Deshmukh. Well, today we are fortunate in having with us Professor P.K. Mukhopadhyay, who delivered this year's Deshmukh Memorial Lecture. Professor Mukhopadhyay was former president of philosophy, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. And if I'm not mistaken, is currently professor at the Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture, Kolkata. The lecture is about the fourth great movement of Indian Renaissance. Professor Mukhopadhyay is a man of varied interests. He has deep concern with Free India's general failure in stemming the marginalization of the indigenous systems of knowledge in education, which started in the wake of the so-called Indian Renaissance. He is also concerned with local and global failure to effectively bridge science and humanities. In his lecture, Professor Mukhopadhyay will deal with higher education in India, more particularly the enigma of a nation without national education, and emphasize the urgent need for greater clarity on what constitutes education as well as its goal. Obviously, the received notion of education with radical rethinking. Professor Mukhopadhyay, I would not stand in the way of you and the audience who are very keen to hear you, and may I request you to deliver the C.D. Deshmukh Memorial Lecture. I must confess, going to Bombay, coming to Delhi, result, bad throat, loss of voice. Anyway, yes, you can do it.
सदाशिवसमारम्भान् शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् श्रीगोपीनाथपादान्तां वन्दे गुरुपरम्पराम् विशुद्धज्ञानोदेहाय त्रिवेदी दिव्यचक्षुषे श्रेयोप्राप्तिनिमित्ताय नमस्समार्थधारिणे धीराकुशग्रमतयो भवतः प्रणम्य मौलौ निधाय करवारिरुहे समीहे वाणीयं विशृङ्खलाप्यर्थरहितापि सानुग्रहेण हृदयेन विलोकनीया. Honorable Chairman, Sorabjee, Most Honorable Kapilaji, distinguished audience, I will be talking about the fourth great movement of Indian Renaissance. I have already made available the complete text of the speech, but I am not good at reading out. I will be speaking, and of course it is a argument is very much twisted, but as simple as possible in the next 30-40 minutes, 40-50 minutes I will be able to cover it. I should like to begin by thanking the trustees of IIC for inviting me to deliver this year's Dr. C.D. Deshmukh lecture. I think it has been, or it is a matter of honor, not to me personally, but through me, to the entire academic community, by which I mean the community of people who are just teachers and nothing else besides. When I was thinking about the subject of the talk, I decided to talk about education, more particularly higher education in India. The choice has been informed by a number of considerations. One consideration has been this, that education is perhaps that point at which the interest and the career of Dr. Deshmukh intersect with the interest and the career of the present speaker. This was the first consideration why I had chosen the topic of education. The second related reason is this, that the trustees of IITs and all the members of IIT, they remember this aspect of C.D. Deshmukh, that his love for education, his contributions to India's education and educational development very seriously and with great honor and respect. The evidence for this is that shortly after the sad demise of Dr. Deshmukh, India International Center, which was established or founded by Dr. Deshmukh, was celebrating its golden jubilee. On that occasion, to remember C.D. Deshmukh's contribution, he had many contributions in many fields, you have seen. They decided to hold a seminar on higher education in 80s, objectives and opportunities. This was the title. After more than 30 years, there are still enough things to be concerned about very seriously concerned about our education. I do not need to give any evidence that it is so, but in any case, an evidence comes handy and I am producing it. Today is 14th January, 28th December 2013, UGC celebrated its 60th anniversary. In that and it was presided over, if I am not mistaken, our present Prime Minister, who had been once the chairman of UGC. On that day, another ex-chairman of UGC, under conditions of anonymity, made certain remarks. It was published. One of the remarks was this: UGC should not celebrate, rather it should reflect. Another thing that was more clearly said there, take up the 1950 Radhakrishnan Education Commission's report and read it in 2013, and you will feel that the problems continue. So, if I have chosen to speak on higher education on this occasion, these are some of the reasons which made me choose this subject. But we also know education is a very vast subject. So what about which aspect of education I am supposed to discuss? When I was thinking about this, I was led to decide this particular theme in consideration of two things. One was one particular feature of education, which you can all verify from your own experience, is a unique feature. It is this: there had never been a time when people were not critical about the current state of education. Every country, every society, every time you take, people are critical about the current education. At the same time, there has never been a time when within that particular situation there are not born some celebrated teachers and some celebrated scholars. What does this imply? I will connect this with another consideration that led me to choose this subject. Apparently they are completely disconnected. When I was thinking about what to talk about, I recollected a strange incident. The incident was Rabindranath Tagore's inability to recollect what I am going to discuss about the fourth great movement of Indian Renaissance. How these two to connect? If it is true that in every time people are critical of their current system of education, and at the same time some celebrated teachers are being born, that means the vitality has not been lost altogether. It has become very selective, but still it is not dead. So it is possible to overcome all the deficiencies and yet make some progress. So in the field of education, maybe in other fields also, deficiency and progress, they are simultaneously present. If deficiency and progress are simultaneously present, how to make sense of it? They are apparently contradictory. What follows from it, or what has to happen in order to make it possible to reconcile them? One thing is this, that progress is not total progress, only partial progress. But I am not interested in that. There is another aspect of it. And that aspect is this, that while ages after ages, period after period, we are discussing the same deficiency in our education, perhaps the deficiencies or the shortcomings is not the same. The problem is only outwardly the same, but inwardly the problem has undergone much changes. And when we discuss about education, if we do not pay serious attention to this fact, that while apparently it is the same problem we are tackling with, but actually the problem is widely different. What happens is this, our talks about education turns into talking in vague generalities, whereas what is needed is very precise and very in-depth examination of the situation. Now, when in this connection I refer to Rabindranath Tagore's failure to remember the fourth great movement of Indian Renaissance, this fourth great movement is the movement of national education. There is a national education movement. He remembered three other movements. Actually, it was in 1936, Rabindranath Tagore wrote a paper, The Philosophy of an Artist. Maybe wrong, The Religion of an Artist. It was his contribution to a book planned by Radhakrishnan and published by Radhakrishnan jointly with Muirhead and published by George Allen. In that article, he begins by noting that when I was born, three great movements were meeting our country. And he named the three also. Of these three, two were of national character. And the fourth one, which he failed to remember, was also of a national character. Now, how is it? Why is it so important, his failure to remember? The first reason is this, that there are three easy ways of explaining why he forgot. One is perhaps the event which we are alleging Rabindranath to have forgotten to mention did not happen, or that it was not very important. The third, that it happened, it was important, but it was just by chance at that particular moment. He has a slip of memory, Rabindranath could not recollect. This is quite possible. And actually it was not Rabindranath Tagore alone who forgot this particular movement. There are many others. Annie Besant, in a published letter, Aurobindo, at that time he was not Shri Aurobindo, Aurobindo in one published letter almost took Annie Besant to task for her failure to remember this national education movement. And long after the independence, it seems to me, if I am wrong, I will be corrected, that entire lot of leaders of free India forgot this movement. And that is what is my matter of concern today. Had it not been so, if the entire leadership of our free India did not forget this movement, then perhaps the state of education would have been much better. But why is it so? The reason is this: if we care to and succeed in remembering what has gone in the past and take it seriously, then we can always build on the successes and failures of our predecessors. But if we forget what had gone before, then we just lose this chance of really building on the work that had already been done. And from my own experience, I tell you that in India, nowadays I find each time we are talking about education, almost each time we begin with this from the scratch. We never make any reference to what works had been done earlier, what thinking had been done there, and not only this about the past thing, even about the contemporary period, what things are going on around right at this moment in different parts of our country, we do not care to remember. So both vertical and horizontal consolidation is lacking. Had it not been so, I think that we would have made better success and a speedier success at that. Now come back to Rabindranath's forgetting the movement. I will state you the reason Rabindranath did not mention it in that paper. And the explanation would have been that he forgot to mention. But I will produce reason why I can't accept it that he forgot. He did not forget to remember. Actually, he wanted to hide something. He wanted not to mention something. And that is why he feigned a sort of amnesia. Rabindranath Tagore's amnesia was a feigned amnesia, while perhaps the amnesia of our current leaders are genuine amnesia. And that is why it is not serving us good. It is not delivering. But in Rabindranath's case, we can understand what happened actually. Rabindranath knew that if he had to publicly acknowledge that he remembered that incident which he was wanting to hide, then he would have to say something negative about some great personality of India. He was a very great personality, and Rabindranath was not feeling very easy or comfortable to show publicly his differences from him. But differences was there. And moreover, Rabindranath was tied to that personality by a special emotional bond. Rabindranath was a confirmed member of Brahma Dharma till his death, and Raja Ram Mohan Rai was the founder of this faith, and the personality in question was Raja Ram Mohan Rai. Raja Ram Mohan Rai initiated an educational reform movement, and while Rabindranath was narrating all the great movements, he simply could not mention it. The reason is this: though Rabindranath never wasted a single opportunity to speak very highly of Ram Mohan Rai, he knew he could not say or do the same thing if he remembered or recalled or recorded Ram Mohan Rai's views about education. Rabindranath spearheaded a different education movement which was critical of the education movement of Raja Ram Mohan Rai. So therefore, if we have to understand the scenario of education in colonial India, then we have to think about it in this way. Education in India in the pre-colonial period, education in India in the colonial period, the first phase, Raja Ram Mohan Rai's phase, education in India in colonial India, the second phase, Rabindranath Tagore, etc. phase, and then post-independence India. Rabindranath actually spearheaded, there are many other people, the second movement which I name here, the fourth great movement. The other three movements were the religious reform movement, it is the oldest of all. Then there was, he mentioned, literary movement, that was the second, that was not all India. The third was the national freedom movement. It was the youngest, and in between this religious reform movement and freedom movement, nationalist freedom movement, there was this education movement. The emergence of the education movement, or the second phase of the education movement, which along with others Rabindranath Tagore spearheaded, marked the end of the first reform movement, education reform movement. This first education reform movement started in India around 1811, and the national education movement did not take shape till in the 1890s. So there is a long gap in between. And obviously, Raja Ram Mohan Rai did not live beyond 1835. But the process was continuing. What was that education and what was the difference? In 1811, beginning with 1811 or something like that, there started an education movement. It can be said to be the Western education movement. It was at that time that in India, Western education or Western educational system was introduced. It started at around 1811, but the first ever European style university established only in 1857 or 53. This shows something to which I will come presently. The idea was this, that when it was a question, or during the colonial period, the British did not quite early admitted that education is administrational responsibility of the ruling race. British people formally accepted it only in 1870s, but in 1811, Western education system or reform movement started. Now in this education movement, attempt was made to introduce Western education. And Ram Mohan Rai was one of the greatest figure and leader of this movement. But there are twofold sort of mistakes that we do. Sometimes it is said that British people wanted to introduce British education system because either there was no education at the time in India, or there is no education worth the name. And the education system that was ultimately introduced was the Western education system. The character of it I will tell you presently. But when national education movement started towards the end of the century, took serious shape, what was actually the issue? The national education movement people, they were opposing the earlier education movement, but what was the issue? If we go by the name Western education and national education, it may appear that the British people, they imposed on India an education system which was really a replication of the Western education or education system prevalent in Britain, particularly for Northern Europe at that time. Even if it was so, what was therefore the objection of the people of the National Council, National Education Movement? Their objection was that these people, they wanted to introduce Western education, but they failed to introduce or reintroduce or revive national education. This may appear to be the objection of the leaders of national education movement against the leaders of the Western education movement. But this is wrong, because it was not in the agenda of Ram Mohan Rai and his colleagues to introduce national education movement. Time is short, I am doing it briefly. Actually, Ram Mohan Rai and those who are said to be responsible for introducing Western education system, they actually did not start any education reform movement at all. What happened actually, they did have no agenda of introducing any education system. Only when around 1811, no, it is in 1823, actually British people, or British government, allotted some money to be spent for the education of the native people. And when the British government, without being persuaded by any Indian, allotted some fund to be spent for the education of the native people, then came up some people, some Indian, how to spend this money. Ram Mohan Rai came with a proposal: the amount made available by the government should be spent for the introduction of Western education. So he never thought about introducing national education. So it will be definitely wrong to say that Ram Mohan Rai failed to introduce national education movement. It was not in his scheme of things. And it will be wrong to blame the British people also, because even though by 1811 or 1820 some fund was allotted, British government took some 20 years to make a firm decision how it is to be done. So they did nothing in haste. These 20 years, there was a protracted debate between the Anglicist and the nationalist about what shape to be given to education. So it was not done in one single day. And strangely enough, in the Anglicist camp, there are many Indians. Among them, Raja Ram Mohan Rai was one. Similarly, in the nationalist camp, there are many Europeans, many Britishers even, who are in favor of introducing national education. And now, it is not that something was all on a sudden imposed on the subject race. After much deliberation, British government, though originally was wanting to promote indigenous education, British government was somehow persuaded by the Anglicist camp, within which there are many Indians, to actually introduce Western education here. This is how the Western education was introduced. But it is wrong to think that we owe, for whatever good or bad, Western education to Macaulay. Macaulay or no Macaulay, Rammohan or no Rammohan, Western education had to be introduced at that time. For demand for Western education was growing at that time, and there are at least some 50 people without any help, guidance or assistance from people like Rammohan Rai or Macaulay. They came forward, they formed a group, and they established that Hindu Vidyalaya, which was turned into Hindu school later on. And since that time, the demand for Western education never diminished. So demand for Western education was there among the public. Many prominent people of the time, many prominent Hindus, they joined together and they wanted Western education for their children. So Western education was established. Then when national education movement started, what was the agenda? Were they against Western education? This may appear to be the case from the name. The case is very twisted, not at all. They were not opposing Western education, for I have told you already that in the society at that time, great demand for Western education was there, and they belonged to that society. So they are not wanting to oppose Western education because it was Western. They opposed Western education because by the time the Western education found to be deficient in many different ways. Many deficiencies of Western education became clear in the 20-30 years of time. One, what sort of deficiencies were there? Whatever else it is, the leaders of the national education movement were opposed to Western education, already introduced, not because it was Western, but because it was deficient. Before I go to the list of deficiencies, it is also their paper, lots of deficiencies. In fact, one of the greatest leaders of national education movement said that Western education that was already current at that time was a failure in every respect. He said commercially, academically, socially, politically, in every respect it was a failure. This statement came from Satish Chandra Mukherjee, the great nationalist as well as educationist. But one question that arises, Raja Ram Mohan Rai was a very intelligent, very perceptive person. How could I explain that being Raja Ram Mohan Rai, he could not foresee these difficulties and the deficiencies and really supported it? Some people gave an explanation. The explanation is this, there is no sufficient evidence, but the explanation is this: Raja Ram Mohan Rai was not completely unaware of the deficiencies actual or possible, but at that point of time, what was exercising his mind was not the niceties of education, but the social regeneration. He thought, even at the cost of introducing an education system which was not completely correct or not foolproof, still we should welcome it because it promises the national regeneration. Because at that time, the Indian nation, in that sense of the term, was suffering from innumerable social evils, and also at the same time there are tremendous economic backwardness. So considering these, perhaps Raja Ram Mohan Rai was in a compromising mood. He was ready to welcome Western education insofar as it can enable some social degeneration. But Raja Ram Mohan's life was full of ironies, you know. In this is not a exceptional case. Raja Ram Mohan Rai is blamed or adored for introducing or for being a person who was instrumental in the introduction of Western education. But two things we forget to remember: that Raja Ram Mohan Rai did obviously wrote a letter to Lord Amherst in 1823 strongly recommending the introduction of Western education. This we all know, but we do not remember that this letter remained unanswered for 10 long years till the death of Raja Ram Mohan Rai. So we do not know what influence Raja Ram Mohan Rai's letter exerted. There is no sure proof. The other thing that also is an irony, supposing it is true that Raja Ram Mohan Rai wanted Western education in order that there could be social degeneration development, the type of education that could lead to social degeneration, when actually it was introduced, it was nothing of that kind. It was not that kind of education which Raja Ram Mohan Rai wanted to be introduced. So it is a real irony that he is blamed for the sin that he did not commit, perhaps. Anyway, National Council of Education movement was started by observing that this education system that has been already introduced was full of errors and mistakes. What were the mistakes? And what the National Education Movement was for? National Education Movement was, in the first place, the leaders were wanting that education should be under national control. This is one agenda of National Council of Education. The second, the National Council of Education, national education should be fed by national resources. Education with national resources and under national control. I have told you when the Western education movement ended with the emergence of national education movement. But when did national education movement end? Did it end? Has it met successful completion? Is it still continuing? I think it is our responsibility to answer. One easy way of saying yes, of course, it is over, and successfully over. When? In 1947. When we achieved independence, obviously the national education program has also been a success. The case is not that easy at all, because when I have been accusing, so to say, our national leaders of forgetting our national education movement, I am really accusing them of seeing that in 1947 they thought that automatically national education movement was over, because they thought that national education movement was just a part of national freedom movement. Because national freedom movement, in its agenda, it wanted the national control in every sphere, social, political, educational. But national education movement, they are wanting national control on education only. So it is just a part of national freedom movement, therefore it is automatically over. But national education did not mean just education under national control and fed by national resources only. It has many other aspects. And in these respects, I think national education movement is not over, and it is worth the while to revisit the national education movement or the fourth great movement of the Indian Renaissance. Whether there was any Indian Renaissance or not, that's a different problem. I'm not entering into it. But what were the other important aspects? One thing was this, that education that should enable us to develop as a nation collectively. So this part of the idea of national education is this, education that is necessary for the rebuilding of the country. And I already told you, have we succeeded in introducing that education which can rebuild our country? That is the most important issue. Now, National Council of Education leaders, they were opposed to the Western education movement because that education they identified is not likely to help the development and growth of the nation. Why? Many European people in the paper, the details are there, I have no time to discuss these things, detected that the whole education system, Western education system, was artificial. And one weakness of it is this, there is enough provision there for the study of Western subjects but not of the Indian subjects. And Raja Ram Mohan Rai in his letter specifically mentioned Western systems or disciplines are to be introduced. Side by side, he also said that Indian systems of knowledge should be discontinued. And this did not go very well with the nationalist leader. They said no, national or indigenous education system should also be introduced and really nurtured properly. So, how much time do I have? 10 minutes? You're fine? 2 minutes. I'll do it. So, what actually the national, to bring it to shorten it, that national education leaders wanting education under national control, there are any number of statements to prove it as an evidence. But there are other aspects of national education, or the conception of national education, that I am now going to tell you, about which there are not very many explicit statements available, but in their activities, etc., you will see. I began by saying that Rabindranath forgot to mention, which he could not afford to mention, because Rabindranath was very intimately associated with this National Council of Education movement. Two of them is this. When National Council of Education movement was launched, one of the best result it could achieve was the establishment of National Council of Education, a body, and it started a number of national schools where they implemented the syllabus of national education. So national education also meant a particular syllabus, and even if there is no statement to this effect, if you look into this syllabus, you'll see that equal, balanced, importance was given both to Indian subjects and to the Western subjects. That was one important point. And when this school was established, not only National Council of Education was inaugurated by Rabindranath Tagore. He made a very impassioned inaugural address, so he could not forget this movement. Secondly, national schools were established, and National Council of Education used to conduct regular examination, and in those examinations, one of the paper setters and examiners was Rabindranath Tagore. So Rabindranath didn't forget it, but he could not actually, for that reason, because of his differences from Ram Mohan Rai, could not mention it. So there, one important part of the conception of national education is an education which will be inclusive and not exclusive. Western education was exclusive. They excluded almost everything that was national. And when it is to be inclusive and balanced, the National Council of Education, under this head of inclusive and balanced education, meant two things. On the one hand, there should be both humanities and science. This is one. That education curricula should be so made that there will be enough provision for humanities as also science. And the other part of it is there will be equal emphasis of Western and Indian subjects. Now, the leaders of the National Council of Education found that the Western education was not balanced. It was exclusive and it was not balanced. It was over-literary. That is why I say it is irony. Raja Ram Mohan Rai wanted science to be introduced in the Western education. But what the education system was actually established, it was discovered by the later leaders that it was over-literary. And because it was over-literary, it was not going to help nation building. So therefore, that is the irony. So two defects the national education is found. One, it was over-literary, and second, it was exclusive. There's no balance. Now, if we come back to the present state of education in India, what do we find? Again, it is exclusive. Much more importance in being given science and technology than on humanities. Humanities is almost ignored. And the other thing also I'll tell you, so far as the Indian and Western is concerned, almost everything in Indian is very much neglected till today. And this is where our national leader failed. They should have revisited the National Council of Education movement, and if they did so, if they spent some time, the time would not have been wasted, I think. But to come back to this point, what was their thinking? The thinking was there, if there was not sufficient emphasis given to science, then through industry, through developing industrial force, industrial management, industrial infrastructure, country cannot be developed. But at the same time, they said, enough importance is to be given to national subject. And it has been rather found out by people like Herbert Spencer that education system, in the name of Western education system, that is prevalent in India, was artificial like anything. For they are being taught in Western subjects without having any knowledge of their own country. And Annie Besant says that our students read all about the history and geography of Western people, but they do not know the history and geography of their own country. Their thinking was this, that for national development, two things are necessary. One, the knowledge of science and industrial force, but at the same time, enough knowledge of the country itself. If we do not know the aspiration of the people, if we do not know the country itself, then whatever other resources you may have, you won't be able to ensure the development of the country. So development of the country needed this two-pronged attack, on the one hand science and on the other hand Indian subjects. And what had happened? So far as the science thing is concerned, humanities has been neglected, and therefore we have been left with no idea of our country as we should have. For science, it is built in science that it is as far as possible neutral and objective, so it does not pay much attention to these aspects of the geography and the history of the country. It's not. But these subjects are not there. Then when humanities subjects is neglected, then we thought that perhaps it is over scientific. So I told you at the beginning that certain problems continue which are apparently outwardly the same problem, but inwardly it's different. Western education was exclusive. Current education, contemporary education of free India is also exclusive. But it was exclusive in the sense of being over literary. It is exclusive in the sense of being over scientific and over technological. But the saddest thing is yet to come. It is still science have been marginalized also. Technology is going to be marginalized also. It is all taken up by the professional, the business management. These are being taught and they are getting increasing attention, and more science, humanities, all things are being marginalized. But so far as that Indian subjects and the people of India is concerned, what have we done? Indian education commissions, some Indian commissions has proudly announced that in the commission there are some 10 to 15 foreigners in the commission, as members. There is not a single Indian Pandit. You will never hear the name of any Indian Pandit. I give you another example. There is a volume was published, an anthology of collection of papers presented in the first 25 years of Indian Philosophical Congress sessions. In them, you will never find even a single paper by any Pandit. Everything Indian subjects, the custodian of Indian knowledge, the ways of Oriental system of education, all these have been simply ignored. I say simply ignored because if after sufficient deliberation, some debates, open debates, deliberations, the government or the leaders came to the conclusion this is the best, fine, acceptable. But they simply do not care to discuss even, debate even, and they make a certain decision. I give only one example and then I'll stop. Quite recently, Indian education, in the Indian education system, as I told you, that many more things are being marginalized. One thing that is being marginalized increasingly, and we are not giving sufficient attention to it, is the university education itself. It is being increasingly marginalized, but in a peculiar form. Earlier, even in our times, a person having a master's degree from a university would be considered eligible for a job, at least for a teaching job. Today, a person having an MA degree of a reputed university will not be considered eligible for a post of teacher in a school. You have to sit for another examination. So you have to undergo those, as if that even university education is not sufficient to make one a teacher. Earlier, the system could make sense that a teacher could be appointed on the basis of his MA degree or BA degree, and then they will be sent for BEd degree. Whenever the time opportunity comes, they are sent for specialized degree and training. In technology institutes, in the industries, the same thing is being done. On the basis of the result of their technological degree, they are directly appointed in the industry. Then when the opportune moment comes and necessity arises, they are sent for training. But university education in our time is such, and we are not paying any attention to it, that an MA degree is not considered sufficient for even a fellowship. For that you have to again pass some other examination. You are not eligible for a teacher's position. Again you have to pass another examination. What for? The university education is. This is one side of it. The other side, that how thoughtlessly we disregard the demands of the subjects and the character of the subjects. I was speaking about the Indian subjects. Now all on a sudden, it has been imposed on us that in every university and every department, semester system will be introduced. It has already been introduced. We have never debated on this issue that instruction can be in two modes. One is lecture mode and the other is teaching mode. There are certain subjects, it depends on the nature of the subjects, that the instruction should be in the teaching mode. Most of the traditional philosophical subjects, I can stand evidence for that not a single philosophical text you can teach in the lecture mode at all. You have to teach them line by line, word by word. The reason? The entire system was the oral system, and our texts are such that they are not at all self-explanatory, and they are to be taught and they cannot be lectured on. So these are some of the examples that are given. So sum and substance of this is this, that it is high time we look back, taking some time, we look back to the history and the philosophy of the education movement through which India passed before it became independent. And independent India should build on the successes and failures, thoughts and experiments that those leaders in the colonial age made, and we can still profit from that. And if we do not do that, then sometimes some of our decisions may prove to be very pernicious for the development of education, not to speak of the development of the country. Thank you.
What about you? Please, you say something and I'll say something.
We had a very informative, stimulating lecture by Professor B.K. Mukhopadhyay. There are many aspects which have never struck me. They really raised a train of inquiry in my mind. And I would request our lab trustee, Kapila Basar, to give a vote of thanks.
You say something and Kubita.
A vote of thanks for concluding.
No, the water, nothing. Honorable President of the ISC, Mr. Soli Sorabjee, our distinguished speaker of the C.D. Deshmukh Memorial Lecture, Professor P.K. Mukhopadhyay, and the many distinguished people who are here, and I want to especially identify, and I'll request her to come and give the vote of thanks formal, Dr. Kavita Sharma. Friends, you've all listened, so have I. This seemingly very simple lecture with facility is as complex, as multi-layered, because the manner in which Professor Mukhopadhyay has narrated the history of what he calls the first, second, third, and the fourth Renaissance, whether it took place or not, is a statement of experience of a teacher and one who's been through this, which he has termed as, in his text, I was puzzled when I read the text, WES. I said, well, I don't know what he's talking about. And IDS, and he had all kinds of abbreviations there. But as he spoke, the three things, or many things, that not came to my mind, but I think that we all need to reflect upon, is the manner in which we are, our generation, not my generation or the younger generation, has been given material for the study of the history of education in India since the 19th century. Am I right? In his most polite manner, he has raised hornets' nests. He has questioned many of our idols. He has also pointed at the failings of all those whom we have considered to be the awakening founding fathers. Sincerity, yes, but as we look back or go through, we have to dispassionately see that we are the children of those discourses. Discourses which he has called the third or the fourth Renaissance, the National Council of Education, and any one of us who has looked at those Education Commission reports, and I've done this recently for another reason, and Kavitaji has just finished her account of the history of the UGC. And when we go back to the Dr. Radhakrishnan Commission report, we sometimes feel that we've taken many turns and twists, but we're still at point one. At a practical level and in terms of structuring of courses, he has drawn attention to the pedagogy. And that attention, I think we need to look at it very, very carefully. Each subject has its own demands. Each discipline has its own demands. And to put all the plurality of those demands of those disciplines into a single uniform pattern of either teaching or of examination ruins. And he ended his lecture, concluded it, by reference to the pundits. Not pundits, I would say, what we have in this country, a knowledge system of different branches, and those knowledge systems of different branches are totally negated. Totally, I say, because I've been fighting and writing impolite letters to the authorities that be, totally neglected in the formal systems. And as we know, those who have pursued these disciplines and who may be in the West, then come and sit with the Maulvis, with the specialists of Arabic and Persian, with the specialists in terms of other languages, and he will be here next month. A Cordana then has to sit with with all his degrees and everything, because the manner in which knowledge was transmitted, its epistemology is different, and not looking at that and not giving it any kind of certification in the privileged formal system, and we are all products of that system, I think means that we are going to lose not what we call heritage, but what we are going to lose is knowledge, transmission, and relevance. And the last, most important, and then we will again learn, as we learned earlier, कि बाहर से आएगा तो मजा आएगा, तभी अंदर देखेंगे. May I now call upon Dr. Kavita Sharma to formally thank our distinguished speaker, Dr. Kavita Sharma. Kavita will just give the vote of thanks. Acha.
Professor Mukhopadhyay, Mr. Sorabjee, Dr. Vatsan, and all the very distinguished people who are here, after all that you have heard, both from our speaker and from Dr. Vatsan, it would be really sacrilege for me to say anything further. I'm a very small follower concerned with higher education, and to tell you the truth, very anguished by what goes in the name of higher education. I read Professor Mukhopadhyay's lecture very carefully yesterday, and I was absolutely amazed at the many layers, the visions, the thought processes as they emerged for over a period of 100 years or so in that very, very erudite lecture. When I read that, I was wondering, what was it really Western education that was introduced, or was it Western education for the colonial subjects that was introduced? And perhaps a distinction needs to be made on that. Because if it was really Western education as it existed, then our national leaders would not have been born after going to the West and coming back, and realizing to what a horror they had been subjected to. Now, reading some documents, if I'm not misreading them, when the first 3 universities were established, they were supposed to be after London University. But basically what they were saying is, we will not have the substance, we will only give it the form. Because it was very dangerous, and politically also very dangerous, to give the natives this much of power and so much of autonomy. And so, while we will have our senates and councils, we will pack it up with our own people and with our own officials, so that these natives do not get the wings to fly. I suspect we are still following that. We still have the form and no substance. Now, several things that were said are, of course, these were only examining universities, but you get a sense of deja vu. Dr. Vatsan mentioned my writing the history of UGC. When I wrote it, I got this strange feeling that committee after committee after committee just goes on talking of the same thing, provides the similar solutions, and yet nothing is implemented, which makes me wonder if we actually do want to implement it. Because really, education is a very contested site. It deals with ideas, it deals with minds, and if we don't remain colonized minds, then this country will not obey the leaders it is obeying. Now, I'm making some very harsh statements, but I really do get that feeling, and that is why I'm so anguished. Of course, Professor Mukhopadhyay has told us what is it that was the problem with this Western education, and of course he has counterpointed the national education and the 2 movements of national education, and then the post-colonial education. I also get, of course, it's documented, but very strongly, why was it so literary? Why was there so much emphasis on literature? Because it transmits cultural values and it formulates minds, how we think. And very often I have, because I'm a student of that same literature, and we have enough fights. Those people who are sitting here from Delhi University will remember the formation of syllabus, 9 years, and then only, debating the canons because we don't want to introduce Indian writers, and even the ones we do, we have ideological fights on whom we will canonize among the Indian writers and whom we will not. That's another problem, our own blinkered thought processes. So, while we say education should be in national control with national resources, I think the time is all past. 60% of education is not in national control and not with national resources. And the emphasis, again, I attend some meetings where they keep saying, okay, now from elite we are going to mass higher education and then we will go to universalization of higher education. Whatever that means, even our terminology of higher education is not quite clear. And it's all commerce, markets, skills, jobs. My greatest discussions in the last 1 week have been with the skills people. That the skills that you are administering are actually de-skilling people. Because we are already a very skilled nation, if only we would look at those skills and try and adopt them. Anyway, I don't intend to give another talk on this, and I'm not even qualified in front of the people sitting on the dais. It's just that I got very worked up when I read that lecture and when I heard you. So I would like to really thank you for stimulating a lot of thoughts, a lot of angst also together with those thoughts. And one of these days, if I have the opportunity, I'd like to discuss that syllabus in a greater detail. But thank you very much for helping us to open our minds a little bit today, to have another way of thinking, and at least pointing to another path which we could explore, if not immediately travel. Thank you very much.